Nobody spoke sign language. The billionaire CEO was leaving, until the maid's daughter signed fluently. "Please don't give up, sir." Those silent words, shaped not by a voice but by a child's hands, would change everything. In the towering study of billionaire Harrison Caldwell, a man who once commanded markets with a single word, silence had become his prison. Deafened by tragedy, abandoned by technology, he was ready to walk away from his empire. No one could reach him, until a 12-year-old maid's daughter dared to break every rule of the household. What she signed that day not only saved a multi-billion-dollar merger, it unearthed a connection buried across generations. This is the story of how an invisible child stepped out of the shadows and altered the destiny of a dynasty. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A silent man's empire was about to crumble in a soundless storm. Harrison Caldwell, a titan of industry, was trapped in a world that had suddenly gone quiet. And in his grand mansion, the only person who could understand his silent pleas was the one person no one was supposed to see. The silence in Harrison Caldwell's study was not peaceful. It was a thick, suffocating blanket woven from frustration and raw power. At 58, Harrison had a face carved from granite and ambition, with eyes the color of a stormy sea. For 40 years, his voice had been his primary weapon, a deep, commanding baritone that could build markets or dismantle competitors with equal ease. 3 months ago, a helicopter malfunction over the Rockies had stolen that voice, along with his hearing, leaving him stranded on an island of silence. His world, once a symphony of commerce, was now a muffled, distorted mess. Lip reading was a clumsy, exhausting art. His own company, Caldwell Industries, a machine he had built with his bare hands, was now a place of confusion. His executives, men and women who once jumped at his softest command, now shouted at him as if he were a child, their exaggerated mouth movements looking more like mockery than communication. This morning was the breaking point. The Omnicorp merger, a deal that would be the crowning achievement of his career, was collapsing. 2 vice presidents, fidgeting in priceless leather chairs, were trying to explain a critical shift in the negotiations. They spoke loudly. They used a clunky text-to-speech app on a tablet. It was a disaster. The nuance was gone. The urgency was lost. All Harrison could feel was the hot, crawling shame of his own helplessness. He slammed his hand on the mahogany desk. The sharp vibration traveled up his arm, a poor substitute for the thunderous sound he wished he could make. He shook his head, a gesture of final, utter defeat. "It's over," he thought, the words echoing only in his mind. "I'm done." He stood up, ready to walk away from the deal, from his life's work, from everything. His team saw his movement as a dismissal. They gathered their papers, their faces a mixture of pity and relief. From the edge of the room, where shadows clung to the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a small figure moved. 12-year-old Amelia Grant had been dusting the leather-bound books with a feather duster, just as her mother had instructed. She was a wisp of a girl with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes as blue and serious as a summer sky. Her mother, Helen, had been the head housekeeper at the Caldwell estate for nearly a decade. Her rules were simple: be invisible, be silent, do your work, and never, ever disturb Mr. Caldwell. But Amelia wasn't just watching a rich man's tantrum. She was watching a man drown. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the clenching of his jaw, the frantic, useless gestures of his hands. It was a look she knew intimately. It was the same look of trapped frustration she saw in her younger brother Noah's eyes every single day. Noah had been born into a world of silence, and Amelia had entered that world with him, learning sign language when she was just 6 years old. She learned it from old library books and grainy online videos, practicing until her fingers could speak the words of love and understanding her brother needed to hear. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her mother's warnings screamed in her head. Don't make a sound. Don't draw attention. But the sight of this powerful man, so utterly alone and misunderstood, felt like watching her brother struggle against a world not built for him. It was a pain she could not ignore. Taking a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff, Amelia put down her duster. She walked out of the shadows and into the thick, tense air of the study. The 2 vice presidents stared, shocked at the audacity of the maid's daughter. Harrison Caldwell didn't even see her at first. His back was turned as he gazed out the window at the empire he could no longer command. Amelia took another step forward. She raised her small, steady hands. Her fingers moved with a fluid, quiet grace, shaping words out of the air. "Sir, please don't give up. I can help." Harrison felt a shift in the room and turned, his irritation sharpening. He saw the girl, and for a moment, he felt a fresh wave of anger. Who was this child? But then, he saw her hands. He froze. His mind, so used to the fog of miscommunication, struggled to process what he was seeing. It was a language. A clear, precise, beautiful language he had begun to learn in frustrating, lonely therapy sessions. A language he never imagined he would see here, in the heart of his own home. His stormy eyes widened. A crack appeared in his granite facade. He watched her repeat the gesture, her expression a plea of pure, unvarnished empathy. He slowly lifted his own hand, his movements clumsy and stiff with disuse. "You understand?" He signed. Amelia gave him a small, radiant smile that lit up the somber room. Her hands flew again, faster this time, more confident. "Yes, sir. I do. My brother is deaf. Tell me what you need." The two vice presidents stood in stunned silence. The multi-billion-dollar Omnicorp merger had just been saved from collapse, not by an army of high-priced lawyers or corporate strategists, but by the quiet, eloquent hands of a 12-year-old girl holding a feather duster. Harrison Caldwell sank back into his chair, not in defeat, but in disbelief. For the first time in 3 months, he felt a flicker of something he thought he had lost forever, hope. And he realized, with a clarity that shook him to his core, that this child held a key that could either lock him away in his silent prison forever or finally set him free. Helen Grant found out about the incident an hour later. She was polishing a silver tea service in the main kitchen when Beatrice Caldwell, Harrison's niece and executive assistant, stormed in. Beatrice was a woman in her late 30s who moved with the sharp, predatory grace of a hawk. She wore her ambition like a tailored suit, and she viewed the household staff as unfortunate, but necessary, furniture. "Helen," she snapped, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. "Your daughter has just made an absolute spectacle of herself in the master study." Helen's heart dropped. She placed the silver creamer down with a trembling hand. "Ma'am, I don't understand. Amelia knows the rules." "Apparently not," Beatrice sneered. She interrupted a board-level meeting. She involved herself in Mr. Caldwell's private business. "I cannot have staff children meddling in affairs that are worth more than this entire estate." Helen felt a flush of shame and fear. She had raised Amelia to be respectful, to understand her place. "I am so sorry, Miss Caldwell. It will never happen again. I'll speak to her at once." But before Beatrice could deliver another verbal strike, Harrison Caldwell himself appeared in the kitchen doorway. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere. He was a mountain of a man, and even in his silence, his authority was absolute. He looked directly at Beatrice, his expression unreadable, and then his gaze shifted to Helen. He raised his hands, and with Amelia now standing nervously beside him, he signed. Amelia, her voice small but clear, translated for her mother. He says, "Helen, your daughter did not meddle. She succeeded where everyone else failed. She has a rare skill, and I need it." Helen stared, dumbfounded, looking from the billionaire to her own child. This was a world she did not understand. People like the Caldwells did not need people like them, not for anything more than cleaning and cooking. Beatrice's face tightened into a mask of polite fury. "Uncle Harrison," she said, speaking slowly and over-enunciating, as if he were a tourist who didn't understand the local currency. "This is highly irregular. We can hire a team of professional, certified interpreters. We don't need to rely on a child." Harrison's eyes flashed with impatience. He signed again, his movements sharp and decisive. He says, "The professionals you hired speak words. This child speaks with understanding. I have made a decision." Harrison paused, looking directly at Helen, his gaze softening slightly. "I am promoting you to estate manager. Your salary will be tripled. Your only new duty is to ensure that Amelia is available to assist me whenever I require it." The kitchen fell silent. Helen felt dizzy, as if the floor had tilted beneath her feet. Estate manager? It was an impossible leap. It was a dream she never would have dared to have. But the cost of that dream was her daughter, thrown into the center of a world of corporate sharks and family intrigue. Sir, Helen stammered, I don't know what to say. Amelia has school. She has homework. She will have the finest tutors in the country. Amelia translated, her own eyes wide with a mixture of excitement and fear. She can do her schoolwork here, at the estate. He says her education is a priority. But he says his company is his legacy, and right now, she is the only one who can help him protect it. Beatrice watched the exchange, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. She saw this not as a solution, but as an infestation. This little girl, this maid's daughter, had somehow bypassed years of corporate hierarchy and family loyalty to become her uncle's most trusted confidant in a matter of minutes. It was a threat, and Beatrice had spent her entire life neutralizing threats to her expected inheritance. Later that evening, in their small, newly upgraded staff cottage on the edge of the estate, Helen sat with Amelia at their tiny kitchen table. The promotion, the money, the tutors, it all felt unreal. Amy, Helen said, her voice heavy with worry. You have to be so careful. These are not our people. This is not our world. You did a good thing today, a kind thing. But kindness is often seen as weakness in a place like this. But Mama, Amelia said, her blue eyes earnest. He looked so alone, like Noah does sometimes, when we can't understand what he needs. I just wanted to help. I know, sweetheart. You have a good heart. It comes from your grandfather. Helen ran a hand over Amelia's silky hair. He was the kindest, bravest man I ever knew. Amelia's grandfather, Sergeant Major Thomas Grant, was a family legend. A decorated war hero who had fought in some of the most brutal conflicts of the last century. He had passed away before Amelia was born, but his portrait hung in their living room, a young man with Amelia's same serious eyes, his uniform crisp, his gaze steady and fearless. He was their link to a legacy of honor, a legacy that felt a million miles away from their life of quiet service. Grandpa always said that courage isn't about not being afraid. Amelia whispered, repeating a story her mother had told her 100 times. It's about doing what's right, even when you're terrified. That's right, Helen said, pulling her daughter into a hug. But you remember this, Amelia. In that big house, doing what's right might look very different to different people. You watch your back, especially around Miss Beatrice. Amelia nodded, but she wasn't thinking about Beatrice. She was thinking about Mr. Caldwell's eyes when he had finally been understood. It was a look of profound, soul-deep relief. And for the first time, Amelia realized that her small hands held a strange and unexpected power. In a world of shouting men and corporate battles, the quiet language of her heart was the strongest voice of all. And she was only just beginning to learn how to use it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind that settled into a strange new routine. Amelia's life was split in two. In the mornings, a private tutor, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, would arrive at the cottage to guide her through algebra, literature, and history. But her afternoons were spent in the charged, silent world of Harrison Caldwell. She became his shadow, a small, blonde presence in rooms filled with powerful men. She sat in on conference calls, her small hands translating complex financial data and aggressive legal strategies that flew over her head. But she quickly learned that her job wasn't just to translate the words. Her true value, as Harrison had recognized, was in translating the intent. When a rival CEO was bluffing, Amelia's hands could convey the subtle flicker of uncertainty she saw in his eyes. When Harrison's own legal team was hedging, she could translate not just their cautious words, but the underlying fear that they were losing ground. She had an uncanny, innocent ability to see past the corporate masks to the real human emotions beneath. Harrison began to rely on her for more than just business. He started asking her to stay for his quiet, solitary dinners in the grand dining hall. Under the glittering chandelier, she would tell him about her day with Mrs. Gable, about the books she was reading. And she would talk about Noah. He wants to be an astronomer, she translated for herself one evening, after describing her brother's latest project, a detailed map of the constellations he had drawn. He says the stars don't need sound to be beautiful. They just are. Harrison listened, his expression thoughtful. He was a man who had never had time for children, not even his own niece when she was young. He had always seen them as small, illogical creatures. But Amelia was different. She possessed a quiet wisdom, a deep well of empathy that he found himself increasingly drawn to. He started to see her not as an employee or a tool, but as a lifeline. This growing bond did not go unnoticed by Beatrice. She watched from the sidelines, her resentment simmering like a poison. Every shared glance between her uncle and the girl, every moment of understanding that excluded her, was a fresh insult. She had dedicated her life to this company, to him. She had learned his business, anticipated his needs, and positioned herself as his rightful heir. And now, her inheritance was being threatened by the maid's daughter. She began her campaign subtly. She would accidentally use highly technical engineering terms in meetings, knowing Amelia wouldn't know the specific signs. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Beatrice would say with a saccharine smile when Amelia faltered. "I forgot we were relying on an amateur. My mistake." She tried to turn the staff against Helen and Amelia. "It's unseemly, isn't it?" she would murmur to other senior staff members. "The way that woman is using her child to get ahead. Such a blatant power grab." But her attacks weren't working. Harrison's trust in Amelia only deepened. He saw Beatrice's ploys for what they were, petty acts of jealousy. It disappointed him. He had hoped his niece had more character. One afternoon, Amelia was walking through the estate's magnificent rose gardens, a place she went to clear her head after difficult meetings. She found Samuel, the head gardener, carefully pruning a white rose bush. Samuel was a man in his late 70s with a face as weathered and kind as the ancient oaks that dotted the property. He had worked at the Caldwell estate for 50 years, since he was a young man. "Heard you held your own against the sharks today, little bird," Samuel said without looking up from his work, his voice a low, gentle rumble. The staff had their own ways of knowing everything that happened in the main house. Amelia sighed, sitting on a stone bench. "Miss Beatrice tried to make me look foolish again. She used a word. Kinetics. I didn't know it. And what did Mr. Caldwell do? He looked it up on his tablet and showed me the definition. Then he looked at Miss Beatrice and just shook his head." Samuel chuckled, snipping a dead bloom. "That man sees more than people give him credit for, even without his ears." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes twinkling. "You know, you remind me of your grandfather." Amelia's ears perked up. "You knew him? Knew him?" "Thomas Grant saved my life," Samuel said, his smile fading into a look of profound reverence. "We were boys, barely older than you are now, when we lied about our age to enlist. Different war, same mud. There was a firefight. I was pinned down, scared out of my mind. Tom, he was already a sergeant then, even at his age. He crawled through 50 yards of frozen hell to pull me out. Never said a word about it after. Just did it because it was the right thing to do." He paused, looking at Amelia with a new intensity. "That's the blood you have in you, child. That's Grant blood. Don't you ever let anyone, no matter how rich or powerful, make you feel small. Your grandfather was a giant among men. And a giant's legacy is a heavy thing to carry, but it makes you stand up straighter." Samuel's words wrapped around Amelia like a warm cloak. He was giving her more than a history lesson. He was giving her armor. He was connecting her to the heroic figure in the portrait, making him real. As she walked back to the main house, she felt a new sense of resolve. She wasn't just Amelia Grant, the housekeeper's daughter. She was Amelia Grant, the granddaughter of Sergeant Major Thomas Grant. And she would not be intimidated. Her new courage was tested sooner than she expected. Harrison had called a sudden, high-stakes meeting. A corporate raider, a ruthless vulture named Alastair Finch, had been quietly buying up Caldwell Industries stock, preparing for a hostile takeover. The meeting was with the board, to convince them to stand with Harrison and fight back. Amelia stood beside Harrison at the head of a massive, polished boardroom table. The air was thick with tension and the smell of expensive cologne. Beatrice sat opposite them, her face a carefully composed mask, but Amelia could see the triumphant glint in her eyes. As Harrison began to sign, laying out his strategy, Beatrice interrupted. "Uncle, perhaps it would be better if I conveyed your points," she said smoothly. "This is a complex financial matter. We can't afford any childish misunderstandings." Before Harrison could respond, one of the board members, a man loyal to Beatrice, chimed in. "She has a point, Harrison. This is the fight of our lives. We need a professional, not your mascot." The insult hung in the air. Amelia felt her face flush, the familiar sting of shame rising in her chest. She wanted to shrink, to become invisible again. But then, she remembered Samuel's words. A giant's legacy. She looked at Harrison, who was watching her, his own expression a mix of anger and concern. He was waiting to see what she would do. Amelia took a deep breath. She stood up a little straighter. She met the board member's condescending gaze. And then she began to sign, not for Harrison, but for herself. Her hands moved with a fierceness and precision that stunned the room into silence. Mrs. Gable had been tutoring her not just in school subjects, but in public speaking and rhetoric. Amelia had been studying the speeches of great leaders. Now, she used that knowledge. Her hands spoke of loyalty, of legacy, of the difference between building something that lasts and simply tearing it down for profit. Her translation was no longer just a service. It was a performance, a passionate defense of the man she had come to respect so deeply. When she finished, the room was silent. She had not only defended Harrison's position, she had defended her own. She had proven, without speaking a single word, that she was not a mascot. She was a warrior. Harrison watched her, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. He had seen a scared little girl blossom into a force to be reckoned with. He turned his gaze on Beatrice, and for the first time, he let her see the full, cold depth of his disappointment. In that moment, Beatrice knew she had overplayed her hand. She had tried to extinguish a small candle, and had instead lit a wildfire. The tide in the boardroom had turned. The members, moved by the raw, undeniable passion of the presentation, began to voice their support for Harrison. The battle was far from over, but a crucial line had been drawn, and it had been drawn by the steady, courageous hands of a 12-year-old girl. But as the meeting adjourned and a sense of fragile victory settled in, Amelia couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She had won this skirmish, but she knew Beatrice was not a woman who accepted defeat. The war for Caldwell Industries, and for her place within it, was just beginning. And she had a terrifying feeling that Beatrice's next attack would not be in the boardroom, but somewhere far more personal and far more dangerous. The aftermath of the board meeting was a period of deceptive calm. Beatrice retreated, becoming a model of cool efficiency. She was polite to Amelia, even offering her a thin, brittle smile in the hallways. But Amelia felt the chill of that smile. It was the cold stillness of the air before a violent storm. Harrison, buoyed by the board's renewed confidence, threw himself into the fight against Alistair Finch. He and Amelia were inseparable, working late into the night in his study, strategizing and planning. During these long hours, their bond deepened beyond that of a boss and his translator. He became a mentor, and she, in many ways, became his anchor to the world. He discovered her sharp, intuitive mind wasn't limited to understanding emotion. He started explaining the intricacies of the business to her, supply chains, market caps, leveraged buyouts. He did it first to give her context for the translations, but he soon realized she was absorbing it all with a startling quickness. She would ask questions so insightful they would make him pause and reconsider his own assumptions. "Why are we trying to protect the Akron factory so much?" she asked one night, pointing to a document. "The numbers say it's our least profitable asset." Harrison signed. "It is. But it was the first factory my father ever bought. It employs 300 people in a town with no other jobs. Sometimes, legacy is worth more than profit." Amelia nodded, her expression serious. "Grandpa Thomas used to say something like that. He said a good leader protects his soldiers, not just the mission." The mention of her grandfather piqued Harrison's interest. "Tell me more about him," he signed. "Sergeant Major Thomas Grant." So, Amelia told him the stories Samuel and her mother had passed down. Stories of his bravery, his humility, his unwavering moral compass. Harrison listened intently. The name felt vaguely familiar, like a half-remembered tune, but he couldn't place it. Meanwhile, Beatrice was not idle. Her new strategy was far more insidious than public insults. She knew she couldn't discredit Amelia's skill, so she decided to attack her character. She began a whispering campaign, planting seeds of doubt with key board members and Finch's corporate spies, who had ears everywhere. The narrative she spun was subtle but poisonous. The poor, innocent maid's daughter wasn't so innocent. She was manipulating the old, vulnerable CEO, isolating him from his family and his trusted advisors. She was filling his head with sentimental nonsense about unprofitable factories and legacy, weakening the company from the inside. Who knew what her mother, the new estate manager, was really after? They were grifters, preying on a man in a time of crisis. The whispers began to have an effect. Alastair Finch's team seized on the narrative, using it in their public campaign to portray Harrison as an unstable leader who was being controlled by a child. The company's stock began to slide. The pressure mounted. The final battle was to take place at the annual shareholders' meeting, which was being held in a grand hotel ballroom in New York City. Finch would be there to make his case for a takeover directly to the shareholders. Harrison would have one last chance to convince them to stand by him. It was all or nothing. The night before they were set to leave for New York, Helen came to Amelia's room. Her face was pale with worry. "Amy, one of the kitchen staff told me something," she began, her voice trembling slightly. She overheard Miss Beatrice on the phone. She was talking to someone on Finch's team. She gave them something. Some kind of document from Mr. Caldwell's private files. Amelia felt a cold dread creep up her spine. "What document?" "I don't know. But Amy, this is more than just jealousy now. This is betrayal. This is dangerous. Maybe we should step away. We can leave this place. We were happy before all this." Amelia looked at her mother's terrified face, and then at the portrait of her grandfather on her nightstand. What would he do? He would never run from a fight, especially not when someone was counting on him. "No, Mama," Amelia said, her voice firm. "We can't run. If we do, Mr. Finch will win. He'll close the Akron factory. All those people will lose their jobs. Mr. Caldwell will lose his father's company. We have to see this through. We have to fight." Helen saw the fierce determination in her daughter's eyes, the same look she had seen in her father's photograph. She knew there was no arguing. She could only pray. The next day, in the cavernous, packed ballroom in New York, the atmosphere was electric with hostility. Alastair Finch, a man with the sleek, predatory look of a shark, had just finished his presentation. He had been brilliant, using Beatrice's leaked information to paint a picture of a company in decline, managed by a sentimental, out-of-touch old man. The shareholders were murmuring, nodding. The sentiment in the room was shifting decisively against Harrison. Then, it was Harrison's turn. He walked to the podium, Amelia by his side. A huge screen behind them would show a live feed of Amelia's hands for the entire audience to see. As they approached the stage, Beatrice intercepted them, a look of fake concern on her face. "Uncle, are you sure about this?" she whispered. "Let me speak for you. Don't let this girl ruin everything." Harrison didn't even look at her. He just walked past, his eyes fixed on the crowd. He stood at the podium, a lone, silent figure. Amelia took her place beside him. She could feel thousands of eyes on her, feel their skepticism, their pity. Her hands began to tremble. This wasn't the boardroom. This was an arena. Harrison placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. He looked down at her and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "We do this together." He began to sign. His speech wasn't about numbers or projections. It was about people. He spoke of the men and women in Akron, of the pride they took in their work. He spoke of his father's vision, of building a company that was a community, not just a line on a stock ticker. Amelia, feeding off his strength, found her rhythm. Her hands stopped shaking. They danced in the air, translating not just his words, but the deep, unshakable conviction behind them. She poured all of his passion, his history, and his heart into her movements. But then came Finch's trap. During the Q&A session, a shareholder, clearly planted by Finch, stood up. "Mr. Caldwell," the man said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "We all admire your sentiment. But Mr. Finch has presented evidence that you recently authorized a $500,000 discretionary fund for the Grant family. It looks less like sentiment and more like you're being bought off by your own staff. Can you explain this?" The accusation hit the room like a bomb. A bribe. Embezzlement. The crowd gasped. Helen, watching from the wings, felt faint. Beatrice smiled. This was the document she had leaked. A perfectly legal trust Harrison had set up for Amelia's future education, twisted to look like something sinister. Amelia froze. Her mind went blank. How could she translate this? It was an attack on her mother. Harrison looked at her, then at the crowd, his face hardening as he understood the trap. He couldn't defend himself. He couldn't explain that the fund was a gesture of gratitude, an investment in a brilliant child's future. Any defense would sound self-serving. They were caught. The room was a sea of suspicious faces. Finch leaned back in his chair, a victorious smirk playing on his lips. This was the kill shot. Amelia looked out at the hostile crowd, and her gaze landed on her mother, whose face was a mask of despair. Then, she thought of her grandfather. A good leader protects his soldiers. In that moment, she knew what she had to do. She stepped forward in front of Harrison. She was no longer his translator. She was his defender. She looked directly at the camera projecting her image onto the giant screen, and she began to sign for herself. "My name is Amelia Grant," her hand said, the movements sharp and clear. An emergency interpreter in the control booth, hired for just such a contingency, began to voice her words, his voice filling the ballroom. "The man you are accusing is a man of honor. The money you are talking about is a college fund he created for me. He did it because he believes in my future. He didn't give it to me to buy my loyalty. He has my loyalty because he is a good man. He fights for his people. And that's more than you can say for a man like Mr. Finch, who only fights for his own wallet." She then turned to Alistair Finch. "You talk about strength. My grandfather, Sergeant Major Thomas Grant, was a war hero. He taught me that real strength isn't about destroying things. It's about having the courage to build and the integrity to protect what you've built. Mr. Caldwell is a builder. You, sir, are just a bully." Her small speech, so simple, so direct, so full of unshakable moral clarity, cut through the cynical atmosphere of the room. It reframed the entire debate. This was no longer about stock prices. It was about character. It was about right and wrong. A hush fell over the ballroom. No one knew what to do. A 12-year-old girl had just stood up to a corporate raider and, with nothing but the truth, had laid his motives bare. Suddenly, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom, save for Finch and his cronies, had erupted in a thunderous standing ovation. It wasn't just for Harrison. It was for Amelia. Beatrice watched, her face ashen. Her perfect, vicious plan had not just failed. It had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. She had tried to frame Amelia as a villain and had instead revealed her as a hero. Harrison Caldwell stood behind Amelia, his eyes shining with tears. He put his hands on her shoulders, a silent, powerful gesture of pride and gratitude. He had come here to save his company. He hadn't realized he would be saved, in turn, by the fierce, loyal heart of a little girl. In the stunned silence that followed the applause, an old man in the front row slowly got to his feet. He was a longtime shareholder, a man who had known Harrison's father. He stared at Amelia, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Grant," he called out, his voice raspy with age and emotion. "Did she say her grandfather was Sergeant Major Thomas Grant?" "The Thomas Grant." Harrison looked at the man, confused. He signed to Amelia. "What is he saying?" Before Amelia could respond, the old man spoke again, his voice trembling. "Harrison, your father told me stories. He said his entire platoon would have been lost in the winter of '44 if it weren't for a young sergeant named Thomas Grant. He said that man saved his life. He said he owed everything he was, and everything he would ever build, to that one brave soldier." The revelation hung in the air, a stunning, impossible twist of fate. Harrison stared at Amelia, the pieces clicking into place with dizzying speed. The familiar name, the stories of bravery. His father's life, his own existence, the very company he was fighting for. It was all a debt owed to the grandfather of the little girl standing beside him. Kindness, he realized, didn't just come full circle. It echoed through generations. The courage of a young sergeant in a frozen forest decades ago had just saved his legacy once again, in a New York ballroom, through the hands of his granddaughter. The fight was over. They had won. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The shareholder vote was a landslide in Harrison's favor. Alistair Finch left the ballroom in a humiliated fury. Beatrice, exposed as a traitor, was fired before she even left the building, her corporate career in ruins. But for Harrison, the business victory was secondary. His mind was consumed by the stunning revelation about Amelia's grandfather. That night, back in his New York penthouse, he didn't sleep. He spent hours on the phone with the old shareholder and combing through digital archives. He found it just before dawn, a grainy, black-and-white photograph of a U.S. Army platoon in a snowy forest. In the center stood a young, tired-looking officer, his father, and standing next to him, with a protective hand on his shoulder and a gaze as steady and serious as his granddaughter's, was Sergeant Major Thomas Grant. The next day, when they returned to the estate, Harrison didn't go to his study. He walked directly to the small cottage where Helen and Amelia lived. He found them in the living room, quietly packing their bags. Helen stood up, her face etched with apology and resignation. "Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, "I think it's best if we go. We've caused you enough trouble. We don't belong in this world." Harrison shook his head. He looked at Amelia, and then at Helen, and he began to sign, his movements full of a new, profound emotion. Amelia translated, her own voice thick with tears. "He says, you belong here more than anyone. He says his father, Charles Caldwell, owed his life to your father, Sergeant Grant. He says everything he has, this house, the company, all of it, it exists because of him. He says it's not a debt he can ever repay, but he wants to try." He then turned to Amelia. "He wants to know what I want, what my biggest dream is." Amelia looked at her mother, and then at the picture of her grandfather. She thought of her brother, Noah, and his maps of the stars. She looked back at Harrison, and her hands moved with a quiet certainty. "My brother wants to be an astronomer," she signed. "But the schools that can teach him are very expensive. And I want to make sure no one ever feels as alone as you did, sir. I want to help people connect." An hour later, Harrison's lawyers were drafting 2 new initiatives. The first was the Thomas Grant Scholarship for Heroic Families, a fully funded program to provide education to the descendants of decorated veterans. Its first recipient would be Noah Grant, who would be attending the nation's top science academy with a specialized program for the deaf. The second was the Caldwell Connection Initiative, a new charitable arm of his company, with a $50 million endowment. Its mission was to fund and develop communication technologies and programs for the deaf and hard of hearing all across the country. Its future director, upon her graduation from a university of her choice, would be Ms. Amelia Grant. 1 month later, life at the Caldwell estate was transformed. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by a new kind of quiet, one of peace and purpose. Helen, now a respected and confident estate manager, oversaw the property with quiet dignity. Tutors and therapists came and went, not just for Amelia, but for Harrison, who was now enthusiastically learning to master sign language. Amelia's favorite change was the weekly video calls with her brother. She and Harrison would sit together in the study, and Noah would appear on a large screen, his face alight with joy as he signed about his new classes, about learning the physics of black holes and distant galaxies. He was no longer trapped in a world too busy to listen. His world was now as infinite as the universe he was studying. One evening, Amelia found Harrison in the garden, standing before the white rose bushes that Samuel tended so carefully. "I was wrong about strength," Harrison signed, his movements becoming more fluid with each passing day. "I thought it was about being the loudest voice in the room, about power and control." He looked at Amelia, his stormy eyes now clear and calm. "You and your grandfather taught me the truth. Real strength is about listening. It's about protecting others. It's the courage to be kind in a world that isn't." Amelia smiled, a genuine, heartwarming smile that reached her eyes. "My mother says kindness always comes full circle." Harrison nodded, looking up at the evening stars beginning to appear in the sky. "It does," he signed. "Sometimes it just takes a generation or 2 to complete the journey." The girl who was supposed to be invisible had not only found her own voice, she had given one back to a man who had lost his. And together, they had started a new conversation, one that would echo far beyond the walls of the grand estate, proving that the most profound connections are not heard with the ears, but are felt with the heart. The victory in the boardroom was a temporary reprieve, a battle won in a much larger war. That evening, a heavy silence settled back over the estate, different from the one Harrison's condition imposed. It was the quiet of anticipation, the tense hush before a storm makes landfall. Harrison found Amelia in the vast library, curled up in a leather armchair that seemed to swallow her whole. A thick book on corporate ethics lay open in her lap, though she wasn't reading. She was staring into the cold, dark fireplace, her small face etched with a worry that didn't belong on a 12-year-old. He sat in the chair opposite her, the leather groaning softly. He waited. He was learning that with Amelia, Patience was a language all its own. Finally, she looked up, her blue eyes reflecting the dim light. She began to sign, her movements slow, hesitant. Today, in that room, I saw her face. Miss Beatrice. She wasn't just angry that she lost. She was happy. Happy that we were fighting. It's like she wants you to fail, even if it means she fails, too. Harrison's expression was grim. He nodded, his own hands forming the words with a heavy finality. Hate is a poison, Amelia. Sometimes, people would rather drink it themselves than see their enemy go thirsty. He paused, his gaze intense. You were brave today. Braver than any executive I've seen in 30 years. You have the heart of a lion. The praise warmed her, but it didn't erase the cold knot of fear in her stomach. Lions can still be caught in traps, she sighed. And she's setting one. I can feel it. Then we will be watchful. Harrison signed back, his resolve hardening. We will face it together. But Amelia knew that some traps weren't meant for lions. They were meant for the people lions cared about. The next afternoon, seeking a respite from the mansion's heavy atmosphere, Amelia found Samuel in the greenhouse, a humid, fragrant world of vibrant green. He was tending to a collection of delicate orchids, his gnarled fingers surprisingly gentle. Trouble follows power like a shadow, little bird, he said, sensing her disquiet without even looking at her. And you're Mr. Caldwell. He casts a long shadow indeed. It's not him I'm worried about, Amelia confessed, tracing the pattern of a water droplet on a broad leaf. It's his niece. She's going to do something terrible. Samuel set down his watering can and turned to her, his eyes kind. Your grandfather, Thomas, he dealt with a situation like that once. Not in a fancy boardroom, mind you. In the middle of a godforsaken jungle. Amelia sat on an overturned crate, her attention captured. There was a man in their unit, Samuel began, his voice dropping low. A corporal. Smart, capable, but eaten up with jealousy. He thought he should have been made sergeant instead of your grandfather. He started small. A rumor here, a misplaced supply order there. Minor things, meant to make Tom look incompetent. What did Grandpa do? He knew who it was. Everyone did. But he did nothing. He just kept doing his job, leading his men, making sure everyone was safe. He told me once, you never give a snake the satisfaction of knowing you hear it hissing. You just watch where you step. Samuel picked up a small pair of shears, snipping a yellowed leaf. But then it got serious. The corporal forgot to relay a message about an enemy patrol. It was a lie. He got the message, he just buried it. It nearly got 2 men killed. After that, Tom knew he couldn't just watch anymore. Did he punish him? Amelia asked, leaning forward. No, Samuel said, and the single word was heavy with meaning. Punishment was too simple. That night, your grandfather went to the corporal's tent. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just sat down and started cleaning his rifle. And he told him a story about another soldier, in another war, who had betrayed his unit and what had happened to him. He never mentioned the corporal's name. He just told the story. When he was done, he got up and left. What happened? The next morning, the corporal requested a transfer to the most dangerous outpost they had. He spent the rest of his tour proving he was a loyal soldier. Tom knew that shame, when it comes from within, is a more powerful force than any punishment from the outside. He didn't destroy the man. He gave him a chance to save himself. Samuel looked at Amelia, his gaze piercing. Beatrice Caldwell is not that corporal. She has no honor to appeal to. But the lesson is the same. A snake will always show its fangs eventually. Your job is to be ready when it strikes, and not let its venom poison you. Amelia left the greenhouse feeling both wiser and more afraid. Samuel's story gave her a framework for understanding Beatrice's treachery, but it also confirmed its inevitability. Beatrice wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to destroy Harrison, and she wouldn't stop until she succeeded. Meanwhile, Beatrice was making her move. Her campaign of whispers had softened the ground, and now it was time to plant the seeds of true destruction. She arranged a meeting at a discreet, upscale restaurant far from the Caldwell estate. The man who met her was Philip Shaw, Alastair Finch's ruthless chief of strategy. So glad you could make it, Beatrice, Shaw said, his smile all teeth. Alastair was so pleased to hear you were willing to be cooperative. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, Philip, Beatrice said, her voice cold. I have what you need to tip the scales at the shareholder meeting, but it comes at a price. Of course, Shaw said, leaning forward eagerly. When Alistair takes over, the CEO position is mine. Non-negotiable. Shaw's smile widened. Consider it done. Now, what do you have for us? Beatrice slid a slim folder across the table. This is a copy of a private trust my uncle set up. A $500,000 fund for the Maid's daughter. It's framed as an educational trust, but you and I know what it looks like. It looks like a payoff. It looks like he's being manipulated, his judgment clouded. It's the perfect weapon to paint him as unfit to lead. Shaw opened the folder, his eyes scanning the document. A low whistle escaped his lips. This is gold, Beatrice. Pure gold. With the rumors you've already been spreading, this will be the nail in his coffin. Just make sure it's a coffin, Philip, Beatrice said, a venomous glint in her eyes. Not a slap on the wrist. I want him ruined. The poison began to spread faster than they could have imagined. 2 weeks before the New York meeting, Harrison received a call from his oldest friend and banker, a man named George Thornhill. George insisted on an in-person meeting. He arrived at the estate looking grim. They met in the study, with Amelia present to translate. Harrison, I'm hearing things, George said, foregoing any preamble. Ugly things. That you're no longer making rational decisions. That you've isolated yourself and are being unduly influenced by the child. He glanced uncomfortably at Amelia. Harrison's face was like stone. He signed to Amelia. Tell him he should know better than to listen to gossip. This is more than gossip, Harrison. George insisted, his voice rising. I've seen a document. A fund you set up. $500,000. In this climate, with Finch circling, it's indefensible. It looks like you're being blackmailed, or you've lost your mind. The board is spooked. The banks are nervous. You're hemorrhaging credibility. Harrison's hands flew, his movements sharp with anger and betrayal. That fund is an investment in a brilliant mind. It is an act of gratitude to the one person who has shown me more loyalty and integrity than my own family. Tell him, Amelia. Amelia translated his words, her own voice steady despite the insult from George. George shook his head, his expression pained. I believe you, Harrison, but the story is what matters. And right now, Alistair Finch is telling a better story. You have to get rid of the girl. Publicly. Distance yourself from her and her family. It's the only way to prove you're still in control. The room fell silent. Amelia felt the weight of George's words, the cold, pragmatic logic of the business world. She was a liability. To save himself, Harrison had to sacrifice her. She looked at him, her heart aching, ready to accept his decision. She would understand. She would step aside if it meant he could save his company, his legacy. Harrison held her gaze for a long moment. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the resolute strength. He saw a child willing to sacrifice herself for him. He thought of his father, and of the man who had saved him. What would Thomas Grant have done? He would have protected his soldiers. Slowly, deliberately, Harrison turned his gaze back to his oldest friend. He raised his hands, and he signed 3 words. Amelia's voice was a soft whisper as she translated. He says, "Get out, George." The rejection of his friend, of the easy path, was a declaration of war. Harrison had made his choice. He wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for her. He was fighting for the principle that loyalty and honor were worth more than stock prices and public opinion. Just days later, as if to test his resolve, a crisis erupted at the Akron factory. A critical piece of machinery, the main press for their entire assembly line, suffered a catastrophic failure. The factory floor was shut down. The cost of the downtime was bleeding the company of hundreds of thousands of dollars a day. The factory manager, a grizzled veteran named McAfee, was in a panic. He couldn't get a clear assessment of the damage. Harrison, unable to fly there and assess the situation himself, was growing increasingly frustrated with the garbled, second-hand information he was receiving via email. Get McAfee on a video call, he instructed Amelia. Now. A few minutes later, the manager's worried face appeared on the large screen in the study. He was shouting into his phone over the din of the factory floor. Mr. Caldwell, it's a mess. The German engineers say the whole hydraulic system is shot. They're saying a full replacement, 6 weeks minimum. The news was devastating. 6 weeks would cripple them, handing Finch the perfect argument that the company's operations were failing. Harrison began signing frantically, asking for specifics, but the manager couldn't understand. Amelia stepped in. Mr. McAfee, she said calmly, her voice cutting through his panic. Let me help. Just show us the machine. The manager turned his phone's camera toward the massive, silent press. Amelia watched the screen intently. Harrison signed a series of highly technical questions about pressure valves and fluid dynamics, terms Amelia had learned during their late-night sessions. She translated them perfectly, but she was watching more than the machine. She was watching McAfee's face. She saw the sweat on his brow, but she also saw the way his eyes kept darting to a junior mechanic standing in the background, a young woman who was trying to get his attention, pointing at a smaller, secondary component. McAfee, in his panic, was ignoring her. Sir, Amelia signed to Harrison, interrupting his stream of questions. Ask him to listen to the woman in the blue overalls. She knows something. Harrison trusted her intuition without question. McAfee, let your mechanic speak, he instructed via Amelia. Reluctantly, McAfee handed the phone to the young woman. Her name was Sarah. She spoke clearly and concisely, her hands smudged with grease. Sir, with all due respect to the German team, they're wrong. It's not the main hydraulic system. It's a single servo valve that's failed. It's a $5 part, but it's seized up and is blocking the whole fluid circuit. If we can bypass it, we can be back online at 80% capacity in 3 hours, and a replacement part can be here by morning. A wave of relief washed over Harrison's face. He signed a new set of instructions, authorizing Sarah to proceed immediately. Amelia, he signed, once the call was over. How did you know? I didn't, she signed back. But I saw that she wasn't panicking. Everyone else was yelling. She was thinking. She looked like my mom does when she's trying to figure out how to get a stain out of a priceless carpet. She was solving the problem, not just staring at it. Harrison stared at her, a sense of awe dawning on him. Her skill wasn't just in language. It was in perception. She saw the things everyone else missed. That day, she hadn't just saved him millions of dollars. She had saved the Akron factory, and she had solidified his resolve. Let them come with their rumors and their lies. He knew who he was standing with. He was standing with the quiet, observant girl who saw the truth, even in the middle of a storm. The trip to New York was no longer just a defense. It was a counterattack. The journey to New York was tense. Inside the private jet, Harrison Caldwell, dressed in a charcoal suit that was his corporate armor, stared down at the sprawling city. He was a general preparing for the most important battle of his life. Across from him, Amelia, in a smart navy blue suit, rehearsed financial data to calm her nerves. It wasn't the numbers that scared her, but the faces she knew she would see, faces full of doubt and greed. Sensing her fear, Harrison reached across the aisle and tapped her hand. He gave her a small, weary smile and signed, "Whatever happens today, Amelia, know this. You have already won. You reminded an old man what is truly important. The rest is just noise." The words, meant to comfort, instead forged her fear into resolve. She would not let him down. The ballroom at the Grand Hyatt was a coliseum. Hundreds of shareholders and reporters filled the seats, their collective murmuring a low, anxious hum. Alastair Finch worked the room like a master showman, selling a future of ruthless efficiency. Beatrice stood by his side, a ghost in a power suit, offering her uncle's allies sad, sympathetic smiles, a masterful, poisonous performance. When Harrison and Amelia entered, a hush fell. They looked small, isolated, a relic of the past about to be devoured. Finch took the stage first, his presentation a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He used slick graphs to frame every recent struggle as a failure of leadership. He painted the near disaster at the Akron factory not as a problem solved, but as a sign of a decaying company. Then, he delivered the killing blow. But the most troubling sign, Finch declared, his voice ringing with false concern, is not in the balance sheets. It's in the character of the man himself. On the massive screen behind him, a copy of the trust document appeared, the $500,000 fund for Amelia. This document shows a $500,000 payment from Mr. Caldwell to the family of his household staff. Finch boomed. A family whose young daughter is now his sole method of communication. Is this leadership? Or is this a man so vulnerable that he has become a puppet for those with a financial interest in controlling him? Outrage rippled through the audience. The accusation, so public and personal, was devastating. It was the confirmation of every whisper Beatrice had so carefully planted. Harrison Caldwell was compromised. The walk to the podium felt a mile long. The atmosphere was no longer skeptical. It was hostile. This was a trial, and the verdict seemed decided. Amelia's hands trembled so badly she had to clench them into fists. She looked out at the hostile faces and saw Beatrice in the front row, wearing a look of pure, triumphant malice. In that moment, Amelia's fear was consumed by a cold, fierce anger. Harrison stood at the podium and began to sign. His speech wasn't about numbers. It was a quiet, dignified defense of his life's work, of his father's principles, of the communities that depended on his company. Amelia's hands, now steady, moved with a fluid grace, channeling his passion, his sadness, and his unyielding strength. But the crowd was unmoved. The poison had sunk too deep. During the Q&A, Finch's planted shareholder delivered the final, rehearsed question about the trust fund. It looks less like sentiment and more like you're being bought off. Can you explain this? The accusation hung in the air, a checkmate. Harrison could not defend the act of kindness without sounding weak. He could not deny it without lying. They were trapped. Alistair Finch leaned back, a victorious smirk on his lips. Amelia looked at her mother in the wings, her face a mask of despair. She thought of her grandfather. A good leader protects his soldiers. And she knew she was Harrison's last soldier. She stepped forward, in front of the podium, in front of Harrison. She was no longer his translator. She was his defender. She looked directly at the main camera and began to sign for herself. "My name is Amelia Grant," her hands said, the emergency interpreter's voice suddenly filling the room. "The man you are accusing is a man of honor. The money you speak of is a college fund he created because he believes in my future. He didn't give it to me to buy my loyalty. He earned my loyalty by being a good and decent man in a room full of people who only care about money." She turned her gaze on Alistair Finch. "You talk about strength. My grandfather, Sergeant Major Thomas Grant, was a war hero. He taught me that real strength isn't about destroying things. It's about having the courage to build and the integrity to protect what you've built. Mr. Caldwell is a builder. You, sir, are just a bully." Her speech, so simple and so full of unshakable moral clarity, shattered the room's cynical atmosphere. A profound hush fell, broken by a single pair of hands clapping. It was Samuel, who had insisted on coming with them. Then another person joined, and another. Within seconds, the ballroom erupted in a thunderous standing ovation, a wave of sound and approval. Beatrice's face was ashen. Her perfect plan had backfired spectacularly, revealing Amelia not as a villain, but as a hero. Harrison stood behind the girl, his eyes shining with tears, his hands resting on her shoulders in a gesture of profound pride and gratitude. In the stunned silence that followed, an old board member, Arthur Penhaligon, slowly got to his feet. "Grant," he called out, his voice raspy with emotion. "Did she say her grandfather was Sergeant Major Thomas Grant? From the 101st Airborne?" He turned to the audience, his voice trembling. Harrison's father, Charles Caldwell, was a young lieutenant in that division. His platoon was cut off in the winter of '44. They were out of ammo, out of hope. Charles was wounded. Arthur's gaze locked with Harrison's. A young sergeant named Thomas Grant refused to leave him. He carried Charles on his back for 2 miles through enemy territory. He saved his life. Charles told me on his deathbed that he owed everything, this company included, to the courage of that one brave soldier. The revelation descended upon the room. Harrison stared at Amelia, the pieces clicking into place. His father's life, his own existence, the very company he was fighting for. It was all a sacred debt owed to the grandfather of the little girl standing beside him. Kindness, he realized, didn't just come full circle. It echoed through generations. The courage of a young sergeant in a frozen forest decades ago had just saved his legacy once again, through the steady, eloquent hands of his granddaughter. The fight was over. They had won. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comment section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.